Welcome to Transcendent Psych. I'm doing a series on Meister Eckhart, the 13th century mystic, theologian, and philosopher who was a Dominican friar. Some of his language is a little bit antiquated for us moderns, but I think he has some interesting things to say. We're going to look today at his book called The Divine Consolations. And it stands in a tradition, I think, of philosophical and mystical texts that seek to reframe human suffering, particularly when suffering is difficult, in that kind of broader view of things. I'm thinking of Boethius's Consolations, for example. So what's the basic premise of the book? The basic premise of the book is to provide solace to people in their suffering by suggesting that our suffering is based very often on a close relationship between the suffering and our attachment to life having to be the way that the self particularly wants it to be. Okay, so we get overly attached, and we're going to see that, of course, has echoes in other spiritualities and philosophers and so forth as well. We're going to touch on to that in a minute. For Eckhart, to understand him, you have to understand how he sees a human being. And he sees the human soul, the psyche, as rooted for all people, religious or not religious, all human beings, as rooted in the divine. That our goodness, he says, is a kind of eternal aspect, an uncreated aspect that comes from the divine essence. And he says, because God is beyond suffering, if we wish to rise above our suffering, need to take the path of entering more fully into the divine. Right? There's a sort of logic there. And he's quite radical. And he says that we should go to the point of almost losing our creatureliness to the extent where we are totally immersed in the divine and in the divine will. I don't think that for him means we'd stop becoming human, but it's like, I'm going to give some metaphors later. The metaphor of a piece of wood in the fire, I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But that we get so united with God's will that he uses the word, we be God, we become God. We're just united with God. Now, if that sounds quite heretical, okay. For some religious people, that might sound quite heretical, but he was nearly tried for heresy. The trials for him happened after his death, but he tried to defend himself and said, I was a little bit misunderstood. But you've got that tradition, even in the New Testament, talks about participating in the divine nature. In one of the letters of 1 or 2 Peter, I think it is, can't remember which one now. The Greek Orthodox Church talks about this idea of theosis, of full participation in the divine. That a human should become divinized. I think it was either Irenaeus or Ignatius, right back in the early church, can't remember the exact name, who talked about that God becomes human in Christ so that the humans may become divine. Okay, this is the journey. This is the big picture of life, of what it is about. So this is Eckhart's framework, really. So he sees our suffering as coming from being attached and affectionate and having affection for this life and for things in this life. Now, he's not suggesting, I want to caveat this, not suggesting that we should despise life. On the contrary, if you read his writings, it's not at all what he's saying. But it's like we should, in this life, be living in step with the eternal, so that we are transformed. And I'm going to give some more metaphors about this, the wood and the fire, in a moment, so that we're actually walking in a very different way in life. And he says our suffering comes from attachment, particularly to kind of 3 things in life. So friends and family, so our human relations, we can be so attached that our suffering is increased. Now, again, we need to balance that, because obviously he's not saying that these relationships don't matter, but that, I guess, from the vantage point of the eternal, we will lose all our relationships in a sense. In a sense, everybody we know, and we'll know this as we get older. Our friends and family will pass in time. Friends will come and go. Are being overly attached to things, to people, in the wrong way. There's a right way to be kind of connected to people, but there's a wrong way of being attached to them in such a way that we add suffering to our lives. And also we can become attached to our goods and property. Again, for Eckhart, he has no problem with us enjoying life and enjoying goods and property and wealth even, but the attachment to these things, of clinging to them, can cause suffering. And a third area he talks about is what he calls disdain from others. So where people may treat us badly, might be, in all sorts of different ways. Again, he's not advocating that we just let people treat us badly. I certainly wouldn't advocate that. We do need to take action where we can, to keep ourselves safe, for example. But what I guess he's talking about here more is, that when we allow ourselves to be pushed off course and we're overly attached to having to have our status and having to be respected by people, that can cause further emotional turmoil, because it's outside of our control. Not everyone is going to respect us in the way we might want, as Eckhart himself found out towards the end of his life. So big idea for Eckhart is an idea called emptiness, and this runs throughout his work, and also this theme of detachment. And there's two quite nice phrases. One I've mentioned already, I'll come back to. We'll get there. One phrase he says is this: no barrel can be filled with two drinks. I'm really picturing him as a German with this big barrel of beer. Maybe that's kind of out of temporal context. I don't know. The Germans were big beer drinkers in the 13th century. But anyway, barrel of wine, whatever. You can't have two drinks in one barrel without one of those drinks or both of those drinks suffering. What he's getting at here is this idea that if we wish to be filled with the divine, then we cannot be filled with our own sort of self-preoccupations and our own kind of independent life that isn't immersed in the divine, if that makes sense. So yeah, I think that's probably self-evident as far as the metaphor can go. Another metaphor he uses is of the eye, and he says, now he's not talking about the pupil of our eyes, which obviously will be like brown or blue or hazel or whatever, but the transparent part of the eye through which the light goes. And he says that's transparent. And it's only by being transparent and being clear and being empty of all colours that the eye can see all colours. And he says this is how our spirit should be. Our spirit should be free and empty of preset colours, so that it can be open to all spirit, is his language there. So this is a way, kind of paradoxically, of kind of saying, actually, it's through emptying of one thing that we allow ourselves to be filled with something greater. So Eckhart takes the injunction, obviously being a Christian mystic and friar, takes the injunction of the Gospels, where it encourages believers to follow Jesus' example, to take up our cross and follow him. He takes that as a call to radical self-surrender, so that we can be filled with God, paradoxically, as a way out of suffering. And is a paradox, right? To choose this idea of taking up the cross. The cross was a symbol of suffering, right? That we could take up this path of suffering in order to be free of suffering. What on earth does he mean? Okay, well, for Eckhart, he thinks of it this way. So there's the way in which we might surrender our will to what we know the divine, and he sees the divine as love, God is love, that we can surrender our will to love, to the divine, so that we are actively doing and aligning ourselves with that path. But we can, and that's within our control and our choices. But there's also this other aspect where there are things in life that are outside of our control. And he says, actually all of that is still under the ultimate control of God. So in theology, there's this idea of what we might call the deliberate will of God, which is things that God might actively do. And then there's what we might call the permissive will of God. So God might allow me, for example, to be, I don't know, in a nation that is invaded and I end up in a prisoner of war camp. Okay, there's nothing I can do about that. I can spend all my time kind of wishing it were otherwise and suffering even more because of that. Or I can kind of, under God, if you like, accept that this is my lot at the moment and do what I can with it and trust that actually I can be the love that God wants me to be in that time and that place. I mean, a great example we could think of here would be, say, Nelson Mandela, who was very active in trying to apply justice in his society and bring change against the apartheid regime of South Africa in the 1980s. But then at points in his life, he is arrested and he's put in prison, right? And there's nothing he can do about that. He could have sat in prison and just kind of complained, but what would that have done? And it would have increased his suffering. Okay, but I think he probably wrote his journals and diaries, which were then very useful later on, right? But it's like, okay, what do I do with the things that are beyond my control? Can I have a kind of acceptance? Whether you're a believer in God or not, you can still embrace that in a kind of acceptance way. If you believe in God, then there's another level to that, which you might sort of see things as everything kind of working out under the divine providence overall, right? Okay, so this, I think, has reminiscences with other thinkers and philosophers in time, other spiritualities. I'm going to get the running order slightly wrong here in terms of chronology, but hey, never mind. So it reminds me, for example, of Friedrich Nietzsche's idea of amor fati, the love of fate, or destiny. And what he means by that, now Nietzsche was not one at all for just being kind of passive and quiescent in life. Certainly no different to Nelson Mandela in that regard. Change what you can change. Take action where you can take action. But there is a sort of peace that comes through not trying to fight those things which are outside of your control. And Nietzsche's kind of advice is like, well, just live this moment as if you had to live it again 100 times, like the Groundhog Day thing. Like, it's like, if I had to live this life or this moment all over again, even though there are things that are outside my control, live it in such a way that I would look back and think I wouldn't have wanted to do it any differently, right? So that's amor fati. So it's not a kind of passive fatalism, it's a kind of embracing the cards that have been dealt to you in life, and being active in changing things where you can, but just going with that flow and not adding to your suffering in the process. Okay, we can see that. I mean, Eckhart in his life, for example, when he was accused of heresy, he fought his corner. All right, and his trial came after his death. Luckily for him, he was taken out of this life before he had to go through that. But he was having to deal with the powers of his day, the powers of the Catholic Church, people that were kind of slandering him and making false accusations about what he was actually teaching. So amor fati, there's a sort of positive acceptance of things that are beyond our control, and we can submit ourselves spiritually in a kind of trust and faith throughout life, and not try to spend our life wishing things in a kind of denial, and a kind of wishing things were other than they are, but dealing with things as they are. It's also Eckhart's consolations here remind me of Buddhism's kind of core cure for suffering. Now, again, they're not Buddhism's not saying that there'll be no suffering that comes in the world, but it's just that so often our suffering comes through our inability to relinquish our attachment to our expectations of life. So we spend most of our effort trying to get and retain pleasure, or to stave off or get rid of um, unpleasant things, even our unpleasant emotions. And so we're just constantly in this push and pull between these two experiences, rather than being able to kind of serenely, with equanimity, um, just be with whatever comes up, pleasant or unpleasant. And again, that doesn't mean we don't try to change things where they need to be changed. Okay, so this is a balanced path, a balanced path here. So it also reminds me of Stoicism, what Eckhart is saying. So the Stoics had kind of this mentality, which was kind of like that, we often suffer more in our imagination than we do in reality, or that we often suffer before things actually happen. So we anticipate, because suffering to ourselves through anticipating things are going to be bad that never turn out to be bad. Just think back, if you've lived like I'm into my 50s now, if you think back, a lot of the things I spent my time worrying about when I was younger, most of them probably never happened, right? Or we allow things to torment us kind of more than they deserve, or we torment ourselves over things that really don't matter. But that's Stoicism's attitude. It's actually like, we create a lot of our own suffering. It echoes that Buddhist way of thinking. Let's give a little bit of pushback here to Eckhart, because you can't help listen to him, I suspect, without these questions coming up. I suspect you may have thought of these questions. The first question is, isn't this a little bit too inhuman? I mean, if you're going through a really difficult time, you probably don't want someone coming along and saying, yeah, well, this is just, you need to be a bit more spiritual, and these things don't really matter in the grand scheme of things. Just immerse yourself in the divine. And I think there is an element in which Eckhart is risking sounding like that. I don't think that is his intention, but he could be misread in that way. So I'll just let me echo. I think I want to say that actually we should be, certainly should be empathetic towards other people. I don't think it's a good idea to go around and tell people you should be more spiritual. You should be kind of like, yeah, well, if you were really kind of, enveloped in the divine, you were less attached to this life, then you might find your sufferings reduced. Although I'm kind of sort of partly echoing this. Yes, it's okay. So it's kind of true that a lot of our suffering is because of our attachment to things, and I think that's a useful thing to hold on to. But at the same time, it does hurt, right? So we want to be realistic, right? So let's say if I'm going through the death of someone close to me, right? Is it a consolation? Is it a consolation to take Eckhart's view here? I think if someone comes along and just tells that to me, I'm not going to find it a consolation. And we need to be able to not bypass our normal human suffering in some sense. We need to be able to, for example, go through grief, etc., etc. But at the same time, and this perhaps is something that we can't just do like that. It needs to unfold and work its way through in our life. I think what a lot of people do in their suffering anyway is we come to a point where we detach from the things that we love at a certain level. How can I explain this? So we become able very often to release the things that we know we can no longer have in that way, while we can still cherish those things. And I think that, for example, in bereavement, that is the path for people, isn't it? Very often it's that being able to come to terms and to let go at a certain level, whilst also still not thinking that thing, that person that they've let go of, it was not valuable to them, right? So it's that's maybe sort of something near, at least, the balance that I would be seeking to achieve. So there's a danger that he comes across as a little inhuman, and he's a Christian mystic, right? So the second question that came up for me was like, well, isn't this a bit too Stoic or a little bit too Buddhist? Not necessarily that Buddhism and Christianity are completely antithetical to each other, because they're not. But I'm thinking of, for example, what would Eckhart have made of Jesus in John 10, where he's at the tomb of his bestie Lazarus, who has just died, and the shortest verse in the whole New Testament is just 2 words: Jesus wept. So is that, what would Eckhart make of that? Is that like, was Jesus too attached to Lazarus? No, I think actually it's okay. It's not just okay, it's inevitable. We are going to be human. So where does Eckhart's thinking help us in this? What do we do with it? Again, I think it's about, we're going to be human, but actually suffering itself often pushes us into this path of, it pushes us anyway very often into this path of detachment. So that if you have lost someone, you release, you do eventually come to release them. They're not there. You can't cling on to them anymore. But you kind of perhaps touch into a higher level of love, whereby you can still cherish their memory and the love that you had, and so on, without having to cling on to that particular experience of having that particular person there. But maybe it's something like what they stood for and what they meant to you. Do you know what? I'm really struggling to put this into words, but it's almost like we're touching into the very light of eternity, the very love springing forth from all eternity, through which that love had its origin and seed anyway. I'm going to leave that there, because I'm not going to do justice to that idea. But I think hopefully you get what I'm saying. So I think Eckhart, does run that risk, but maybe all perspectives that are trying to offer something, there's always a kind of, well, what about aspect to a lot of kind of big ideas. So the last things I want to touch on here are really just this kind of notion of, how is it possible to walk through life in a way that that we still love, right? Because this is not about not living a human life, and not about living in human goodness, because we've said already that Eckhart sees human goodness and real love as ultimately divine. So how do we walk through life in a way where we are really human, more human, arguably, and filled with that love and that divine life, and yet we're not suffering in the way that many people might suffer? That we can be detached, but by that I don't mean kind of emotionally distant and inhuman. How can we define this a little bit more closely? I think the clue is in where Eckhart talks about losses. That for a lot of our suffering comes through this fear of loss, or as the Buddhists would say, it's the fear of losing or not retaining pleasure, or the fear of getting pain. And it's being able just to rise up a level or two above that, so that we can be grounded in something deeper, a different mode of that love. So it's not creaturely love. This is what Eckhart's saying. It's not love that is constantly at the mercy and the whims of change, because this temporal life is always a flux, as Heraclitus might put it, a flux of constant change. It's about not attaching our deepest will and value and being to the boat that's kind of constantly up and down with the tides. But it's about anchoring ourselves in a love that will allow us to move to be anchored and strong and rooted in a divine love, no matter whether the tide is going in or out. Does that make sense? So a lot of our loves are based in and are grounded in a kind of conditionality of change. So, for example, most of us will only love people as long as they're loving us back. Now, a divine love will take a different part of that. It just wants to be love, no matter. So it's about being the quality of person rooted in the eternal and rooted in love that we are for ourselves, and not just being at the mercy of others' changeableness and life's changeableness around us. Now, the person that is rooted in that way of being is more stable and is going to be suffering less than somebody whose happiness is conditioned by the control of things outside of their control, right? The ebbs and flows of life, the changing whims and favors of people around us, etc. Right? You want to be rooted in the divine love. So it's coming from the inside out rather than from the outside in. So that's a good question to ask yourself. Is my mode of being, my modus operandi in the world, is it coming from that deep divine rootedness in the place of love, and I'm expressing that out, or am I just reciprocally responding to the world all the time? Okay, yeah, I think that's what I wanted to say. Now, Eckhart is going to finish on a nice metaphor Eckhart uses. He talks about us being a bit like a piece of wood. And the person that is really divinized and filled with the divine, he says, is like a piece of wood that's in the fire. Now, it might be, first of all, that the wood smoulders and smokes and crackles. Maybe there's some real resistance, first of all, but as it surrenders to the fire, it surrenders to the divine goodness, to the divine life, to the divine love. That wood eventually, if it keeps consenting and remains in the fire, it becomes one with the fire. You can't see where the fire starts or stops and where the wood starts and stops. If you ever sat around a campfire, you can see a glowing ember that's just orange glow of fieriness. And that is the vision that Eckhart puts to us, that that's what we should be. Now, you could say, well, what does that mean, that we're losing our humanness? No, That wood is still a piece of wood. It's now just a fiery piece of wood. And that's the picture that Eckhart has for us, that we don't, it's not about not being human. We talk about all this stuff about detachment or emptying ourselves, like the barrel that empties out of water, that, it's about being it's a greater experience rather than having a barrel full of water or stagnant water. It's like, empty that out. Let's put wine in here, right? So it's about being a glowing ember and someone that is, fired up by the divine presence and glowing that out. And I would suggest that actually people that, this might sound like kind of airy fairy mystical stuff, I would say actually that the people that do the most good in the world, think of your Martin Luther Kings or your Rosa Parks maybe, or your, Nelson Mandelas, are people who have that deep fire that they allow to consume them from within, and that it's really actually very difficult to give heat and light and warmth to the world if you aren't aglow with that love in yourself already. You can try and pretend to be a glowing piece of wood in the world. You probably won't get far. And of course, everybody, as Eckhart says, everybody has this divine spark of goodness within them. But it's the question of like, okay, was it a spark that's kind of giving off a few flickers of smoke at the edges of the bark, or is it a glowing ember? And that is the call that Eckhart gives to us. And his thinking is, look, if you're surrendered to allowing yourself to do God's will and accepting that whatever happens in life that's outside of your control is ultimately under the divine control, and your will is submitted to that, there's nothing left against your will, is there? Everything, to finish, say, on the words of St. Paul, everything works itself out for those that love God. I'll close on that and just suggest actually a couple of points to perhaps go away and reflect on. So firstly, I want to say, if you're suffering, do seek out the help that you might need. So this isn't about not seeking out help. You might need help if you're suffering from, say, something in terms of your mental health or other areas of life. It is right to get the right level of help. Okay. This talk might not be addressing some of those things as such. Second thing is, ask yourself, how are you attached in this world? You can enjoy human life, ordinary human life, riches, poverty. Are you bothered? Are you attached to whether you're rich, whether you're poor? Eckhart kind of says, actually, either way, you could be either. It doesn't matter. We could say, you could be the richest person in the world, and yet none of that, you're attached to none of that, you're free. But equally, you could be a poor hermit who has one possession that you're overly attached to, and kind of it controls you. So the question to ask ourselves is, like, in our possessions and in our relationships, whatever we have, great or small, are we able to be free with those, or are they kind of consuming us so that they become our life? Are we possessed by our things and our relationships, or are we possessed, owned by the divine love and the divine will? I'll stop there. Those are the two questions really I wanted to ask and leave you to reflect on. Thanks for listening. If you are so inclined, do put a like. It does help us on the old YouTube algorithm, and I'd love to hear any comments that you might have on this, or further insights would be especially welcome. So yeah, take care. See you next time.